And I welcome everybody to this webinar hosted by the Bowman Center for Sustainable Energy. We are an all-volunteer sustainable energy think tank based in Sarnia, Ontario. Our volunteers have worked and lived across Canada, and we recognize that our office in Sarnia is on the traditional territories of the Three Fires Confederacy, whom we respect and honor, and make this land acknowledgement as part of our normal proceedings, because the land that sustains all of us is what we need to be concerned about for all energy circumstances. The Bowman Center for Sustainable Energy has been around since 2010. We are a federally incorporated nonprofit organization. We have approximately 24 associates in our organization who bring to bear several different skill sets and different interests, all with the focus of catalyzing nation building big energy projects that move Canada towards a sustainable energy future. This series of webinars is based on the idea that we want to learn more ourselves, and we also want to be able to share what we know with other people as well. So I welcome everyone who is attending this webinar. Our speaker today is an associate of the Bowman Center for Sustainable Energy, Peter Smith. Peter has a background with a career in producing electricity through TransAlta. He has also been active on social causes and in the political arena. He brings to the Bowman Center a tremendous amount of zeal and energy, personal energy, to push forward on these ideas. Today, he is sharing with us the information he has from a lifetime of working in the field to help everyone understand the electricity system in Ontario. Peter, I welcome you to begin your presentation.
Thank you for the introduction, Marshall. I'm just going to share my screen now. That's not, let me try again. There's always a gremlin as soon as it works fine before you start. So Don, I don't know if you can help here. It's just not, oh, there we go. There we go, now finally done. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about the Ontario electricity system. I'm not going to be able to tell you absolutely everything about it because, as you can imagine, it is a huge subject in itself. But just to give you an overview of the system, how it works, and what things you can do in order to benefit from buying electricity, or how to get it at a cheaper rate. So we'll start off with just look at the.
Excuse me, Peter. Do you want to just go to
there we go.
From beginning? Thank you.
Yep. Let's just start talking about the major players. The Ontario government is obviously one of those. It's their job to set policy and goals for the organizations that form the industry, but they've never been able to restrict themselves to not getting their fingers in it in some way or another. And you'll see that, and this applies to all governments. I think they've all done it to a certain degree, and not always to the betterment of the system. Outside of the government, the independent electricity system operator is really the biggest player. It's their responsibility to forecast and plan for new development, new capacity, 18-month and a 10-year plan. It's also their duty to ensure that we meet demand on the system every day, and that it's safe to operate that system during that period of time. They develop and administer the rules, and the rules are extremely detailed and extremely deep. I doubt if there is one person anywhere that understands all of it. There are experts that understand certain parts of it and can bring it together, but it is copious, the documentation. They also administer financial state settlements for those that have bought power, those that have sold power into the system. And finally, they're responsible for the interaction between Ontario and our neighbours, the other jurisdictions in this area, and towards all the members of NERC, which is the Northeastern Reliability Council. And that really relates to things like the interactions between the players, ensuring that there's capacity available to supply each other in the event of an emergency, etc. So Ontario Power Generation, they own and operate the heritage assets, Niagara Falls, Darlington, Pickering, and a few new gas-fired stations as well. Hydro One, they own and operate the wires. So all of the transmission system, which is 50 kV and above, they also own the distribution systems in rural areas where there aren't LDCs, and we'll talk about those in a minute. So a number of individuals may still be supplied by Hydro One if they've got a remote home, for instance, but also large emitters, large consumers that are on the high voltage transmission system. They're all connected through to Hydro One. And then local distribution companies, these are in places like Sarnia Lambton, where you have Blue Water Power. They really own the distribution systems in those urban areas and manage them and maintain them. So we talked about the need. The first thing is that electricity the supply must meet demand at all times. This is a graph taken in June 2019. Nothing special about that month. It just happened to be something I had the data for. And you can see on there, this is the entire month laid out, the demand. You can see in there's sort of a daily pattern to it. If you look closely, you can see where the weekends come in there. And then you can see there's an area towards the end where it starts to pick up higher demand, and that was probably due to hotter weather. So there's a certain amount of predictability about the electricity demand. But to meet that demand is a little more difficult. So each generator that's on the system offers in at its incremental cost of production, basically saying I can supply this much electricity at this rate from this time on. And generators are then ranked by their offer price and dispatched in the most economical way. And by economical way, that doesn't necessarily mean the cheapest first, because there's other factors to take into account. You need to make certain you've got a certain amount of spinning reserve online at all times. You may need to ensure that you've got some plant that can ramp up quickly. Some facilities can increase their production faster than others, and we need to make certain that those are in there. So it's the most economical way. Price is then set, and dispatch orders are issued every 5 minutes to every one of the generators. And basically it tells them where they need to be in 5 minutes from now. So if they need to go up, they can start ramping up over that period of time. Also, the ISO will contract with some generators to actually physically control their generation, and that would allow them to trim up and down by perhaps a few megawatts or even tens of megawatts if need be. In order to make certain that they are meeting the requirements on every time. And then there's also some software that runs that looks at single point of failure to ensure that basically there isn't a single point of failure. So it runs through all the combinations of if a piece of equipment goes down, a line goes out, where's the flow going to be, where's the load going to go. What we want to avoid is a single point of failure causing a larger outage than necessary. So market price is set in 5-minute intervals, and these are referred to as the market clearing price, right? The weighted average of the market clearing price is averaged into an hourly price known as the hourly Ontario energy price, and it's called HOPE and HOOP by different people, and probably a few other combinations. In a typical market, and this isn't a typical market, I might add, generators would then be paid that HOOP price for their generation, whatever they've put into the system, And consumers would then pay the same hoop price and the cost of sort of transmission, distribution, admin overheads, those kind of things. And that would be the limit of the charges against or for generators or against consumers. So here's that same month that we looked at before, where we looked at the demand, and this is the price. And if you look closely, you can see just sort of the faint outlines of the demand that we saw before. You can see a little bit in there of the daily pattern. But what you do notice is that it is very much different from it's not just driven by demand. There must be a lot of other factors at play in here because the two do not track very closely. I actually put them into a scatter diagram. And from this one, you can see there's a relationship between the price of the hourly price and the demand, but it is very small. And you can see it even more in this one, where I just took out anything over $100 per megawatt hour. Again, there you can see there's a wide scatter of points in there. This is for an entire year. But so you can see if you look right at the far end here, you've got the maximum here of demand, say, of 24,000 megawatts. And you can see there are prices in there. There's one in there that's only just over $20, right? So the relationship between demand and price is weak, to say the least. So what happened to our market to make it untypical was that it opened in May of 2002, and on November of 2002, in expectation of an election provincial election coming up the following year, the price, as the market had opened over that summer period, the price went up a little high. That got a few people scared. It got the Premier scared at that time, and he went and put a cap on the price of power. And that had the effect of drying up all of the capital. There was no new investment. It really wasn't until 2005 that any new investment took place. And at that point in time, nobody was going to just come in and build something on the hope that they would get a return on it. Nobody would build without getting actually a physical contract from the IESO to ensure that they could make a reasonable profit from their investment. So what happened in 2005, they started making contracts for renewable and for natural gas powered energy. And Global Adjustment was created in order to finance these new contracts. And it was something unique to this market. It's since become a much larger issue. So contract types, and these have stayed relatively the same the way through. What happens when ISO is looking for additional generation? They issue an RFP and specify the type of generation they're looking for and the locations they're looking for. Solar tends to be fixed price per megawatt hour for a 20-year term. That's on the basis that the cost of building the facility is virtually 100% of the total cost you're going to see. Very little in terms of administrative or maintenance costs are required for a solar plant. So factor that all in, get one price, and that price in dollars per megawatt hour will remain there for the 20-year term. Wind is slightly different, but again, it's really capital intensive. It's all about getting that payback on your investment. And the escalation that they've allowed in there is only 20% of CPI. So next to nothing, but recognizing that it does require a bit more annual work, maintenance, and administration. Hydraulic plants, fixed price with escalation over a 20-year term. That's for existing and for some new ones. And then for natural gas, the capacity contracts with escalation, and we'll get into these in a bit more detail. They for 20-year terms again. In fact, all of these have been for 20-year terms. So the way the capacity contracts work is, first of all, they need to qualify on the megawatt that they're going to supply. So what they're looking for from a developer is, first of all, the capacity that they can produce. Secondly, the heat rate, the amount of gas that they're going to burn for every megawatt hour. And then the total cost of incremental generation. And that's going to be the basis of the heat rate, plus some little bit for variable maintenance and other variable costs. Usually that one sort of runs around $3 to $5 per megawatt hour. So it's really going to be the price of gas which drives this in the end. So then what's required is that the plant is going to run whenever the hourly operating price is above the strike point. So when each company is going to offer in and say, okay, gas is $3 at the moment. I need 8 gigajoules to make a megawatt hour. So therefore I need to get $24 plus whatever I need for incremental maintenance costs. So let's say the number's $30 a megawatt hour overall. That's part of the contract. That's agreed in the contract. And obviously it just varies on the price of gas. So then when the hoop price is above $30, you would be expected to be running at the capacity that you've contracted for. And what that means essentially is you've got some time there, obviously, to ramp up there. But the ISO is going to expect to have, if you've got a 100 megawatt unit and that's what you're contracted for, that you can produce 100 megawatts during that period of time. They're looking really for two things. Firstly, that you actually do put it in there, right? And that it does meet the capacity. And if it doesn't, there are remedies to go through for that. But the other part of this is that they're going to have deemed you to have run. And what they're going to do then is doing that, they will have deemed you to have earned so much from the market. So if your offer-in price was $30, but the market was at $40 during that period of time, you will have made a $10 profit. So now they're going to take that away from you, essentially, when they do the square up at the end of the month, because that is capacity. That is an additional benefit that you're not entitled to. So then each month you get a capital payment, a capacity payment, which is based on the capacity of your plant. You will then have that adjusted down for anything that you've earned from the market in that period of time. If for some reason you didn't, if you had an outage on your plant and you couldn't meet that generation when it was called for, you're going to lose some money on that because they will still deem you to have operated. So you just won't, it will be reduced as if you had operated, if you like. So it's a little bit complicated, but it does at the end of the day work out that there's a benefit to each company based on how much it's cost you to run your plant, to build it, to finance it, etc. Now, local distribution companies, we touched on them lightly. These were set up in urban areas to own and operate the distribution systems. They do, operate in their own manner, in that there are differences between LDCs. There are differences in the way that they charge their customers for power. They may group them in different ways and have different charge rates, depending upon factors that are perhaps unique to them. Overhead costs are all regulated by the OEB, so they have to go and get approval every year for new rates. The LDCs pay then for the energy that's delivered to them from the ISO, plus any administration charges, and then they factor that on to their customers. But we're going to be looking more at what happens to larger consumers. I think we've probably covered this one here. Lost cost of power to small consumers. It's the LDCs, as I say, that set the price structure. Costs are based on charges coming in, and then their maintenance and overhead charges. So to large consumers, things are a little different. the number of they're going to pay for a number of things. First off, HOEP, which is the cost of generation for that period of time. Then there's an addition to this from Hydro One, two parts of this. There's the transmission charge and a connection charge, and that's paying for the use of the transmission and transmission system and their overheads as well. There's an additional charge here which would be applied if they didn't have a transformer as well. If you relied on hydro networks to provide the transformer, there's an extra charge for that, but most connections, most customers don't. There's also a charge from the IESO, which covers a number of things like salaries. They refer to it as uplift, which sounds rather nice, really. It's something you think you'd want more of, but it's not the case. But fortunately, those are kept down to about 2 megawatts, $2 per megawatt. There's an awful long number of these, and it's really in a lot of cases to deal with things that happened in the previous month as to perhaps how rates were miscalculated based on ramp rates and other things. So it's all lots of little connections that take place, but they don't seem to add up to much at the end of the month. And then if you look at this, and you've got global adjustment, $66 per megawatt hour. And if you put that into a pie chart, this is what it looks like. Global adjustment is about 3/4 of the cost, or was 3/4 of the cost going out to a large consumer, a large load. That presented a number of problems, particularly for the politicians. Since most people had a problem understanding what the global adjustment was even paying for, trying to convince them that they should pay this much for it was a communications problem, I think, for a lot of people, and particularly for the government. It's been embarrassing for them. It did more than that, though, because it has grown over the years. If you look at this chart here, you can see how the global adjustment has considerably gone up pretty much every year. There's a bit of an anomaly in 2021, but we won't go into that. But you can see as we've got more contracts in place, obviously the costs associated with this go up. And if the cost of the average weighted cost of power, the HOEP, if that was to increase, the global adjustment would decrease, and it would look a lot nicer. At least you'd have that feeling that you were paying for the generation of the power, not for something that's a little more difficult to grasp here. So the global adjustment collects all costs going to contract holders, covers the cost of generating capacity required to meet peak loads. It's increased along with the increase in contracts, I said, and it's reached 75% or thereabouts of total costs. As a result of this, industry, the cost to industry were making them uncompetitive. It was a barrier to new investment, and again, big political concern. So in 2011, they created what they termed the Industrial Conservation Initiative. And the intention of this was to remove some of the costs from industries and to put them onto other users of the system, which basically means residential and commercial. Oops, I think we just jumped to there, did we? Yeah, sorry, there we go. So what they did was created two different classes of consumers here. We'll talk about Class B first, because that's kind of the no change one. And the way that was working was you shared the cost of global adjustment on the basis of your total percentage of consumption during that period of time. So if we were calculating it on a monthly basis, and if you consumed 1% of total Ontario consumption, then you would pay 1% of global adjustment, which seemed like a pretty straightforward way of doing this. The argument from industry was that they were not responsible for the way that the amount of spare capacity that the system required. basically they said, their loads were pretty flat. It's the residential and commercial loads that really go up and down a lot, and increased demand for that last megawatt. And it's the last megawatt, the peak megawatt, that really costs you the most. You have to maintain generation. You obviously have to have the plant there that can produce that last bit of electricity. And yet it may not run very often because that's only going to be demanded a few times in the course of the year. So there's very high costs associated with producing that last megawatt of power. So what they did was they said, well, under Class A then, and this will only be for larger consumers, and it started off at 4 megawatts. It's now down to 500 kilowatts. But they will share the GEA on the basis of, again, of that share of total consumption, but rather than of the individual month that they're doing this as, to look at the 5 peak consuming hours in that year, the 5 hours in which demand was the absolute highest. And then to average those and use that as their yardstick just for these larger consumers. Statistically, that's a much better option than Class B. So you're paying a percentage of a much, smaller percentage of a somewhat larger number. As an example here, Class A here, this was taken just some data that I got. I think this is 2019. So the average of the 5 peaks, 21,400 megawatts. The average consumption throughout that year was 15,700 megawatts. And the total global adjustment costs were $9 billion for the year. And what it meant was that moving from Class B to Class A reduced the GA costs by 27% without doing anything at all, without changing anything else. So an absolute obvious thing for any large load to do. However, it also provided some other benefits, some opportunities, I might say. Since there's always the opportunity to forecast when those peak hours will occur, those 5 peak hours, and if you can reduce your consumption in those 5 peak hours, there's money to be made. So again, using the same data in here, if you could say I've taken 1 megawatt off of my generation, my consumption in each of those 5 peak hours, that would save me $420,000. So there's a lot of things you can do in order to reduce consumption that may not make economic sense on themselves. Maybe, you're running a diesel generator or something in place. It's not a good financial decision for that exact hour, but overall, it's very beneficial if it can lead to reducing your consumption in those 5 peak hours. So to forecast these peak hours, the ISO actually monitors this and does a pretty good job of reporting, what has been set so far, and certain outlooks. But if you look through the data, if you go back through the hourly costs and you look at where those things occurred, there are some other patterns that you can see. The time of year is obviously a big one. At the moment, we're a summer peaking load. That may change to a winter peaking load if more people take up heat pumps. But at the moment, most of these hours are set in the June, July, August period. There are third-party consultants that are out there that spend their time analyzing these things and forecasting them for people. And one thing I'd say is, from the information we saw earlier, price is not a very good predictor. You can't rely on just saying, well, I won't use the electricity if the price is above a certain point, because that may not be the best thing to do. But there are things that you can do. So sometimes you can reduce production. Plants often have a finishing line or a packaging line with over capacity, so you maybe have to shut that down for an hour or two. You've obviously got to put enough effort into this to be able to predict where those hours might be. You may have to shut down for perhaps 10 hours or a dozen hours throughout the year in order to make certain that you cover the 5 important ones. But those are just the the cost of doing this. Applying for having a battery backup may be another option to this, something that you can rely on to generate a megawatt or two. Or even using natural gas, diesel, or if you've got steam drives, something like that, in order just to reduce the electricity consumption during that period of time. But what this does do is it gives you lots of opportunities. If you've got a facility perhaps that you can bring on and offline easily, you could avoid paying almost all, or maybe even all, of your global adjustment charges if you could shut off and not consume anything during those 5 peak hours. Provides a lot of opportunities, and I think it gives good time for people to find some ways to make this work for them. So that's all I had to say. I'm now open to questions, and I'm hoping that Marshall's collected a few of those in the box.
Thank you very much, Peter. I was quite absorbed in that, and I see others have also been absorbed. There's just a few questions that I have. The first question, you identified several criteria that are used to identify the price and the costing within the Ontario electrical system. Do you have any expectation that there will be a measure of carbon intensity to assist IESO in determining who will be given the right to sell to the grid?
Yeah, I don't know quite. I think my first question would be, so what government are we going to have next time? Because that may well determine it. Let me tell you one thing that they're doing at the moment that I think is taking them in this direction. And that is they're proposing putting in some legislation that would allow a company to purchase electricity directly from a generator on the same system. So at the moment, in theory, you could set up a financial arrangement if you wanted just to guarantee the price of power between two parties, and you could do a sort of financial settlement. But where the value is today is a lot of companies want to be able to say, we use 100% emission-free generation power. And they can't do that in the electrical system in Ontario at the moment. But if they can contract with somebody that's going to build 100 megawatts of wind power, for instance, and contract directly with them for their whatever load they want of clean, renewable power, then they would be able to do that. So they've been collecting comments on this proposal. I think that was closed just middle of last month. And so we're expecting to hear something sort of probably later this year as to how they intend to do that. That will, I think, will drive them in a certain direction. Once people become linked to the fact that they can get emission-free power, then that's going to drive more of that investment in there. And what the government, how the government handles it at that point in time becomes a little more difficult, because they're not going to have direct control over these generators and who's building.
Okay, that leads to a second question that I have, and that is regarding the contracts, because you mentioned that the contracts are complex, and you just mentioned that there will be different contracts going forward for people who wish to purchase power directly from generators. Are the current contracts made public, or are they kept private between the current generators and IESO and current consumers and IESO?
The nature of obviously the things that's confidential is the costs, right? So that data is definitely confidential, but the basic contracts are fairly well known. There are sort of the mechanisms that are in those contracts are well known to everybody. But things that might be specific to a particular plant somewhere, those remain confidential.
Okay. There's a question in the chat regarding the global adjustment charge, pardon me, and does that apply to the local distribution companies or LDCs?
Yes, yeah. So the LDCs, they get charged global adjustment. I'm not certain. I don't think they have the Class A or Class B. I don't know. Alex Palamaker is somewhere in the audience, and I'm sure he knows the answer to that. I've never asked that question actually as to whether the LDCs are Class A or Class B.
Okay. There's a question pertaining to CO2 emissions, and could we use the CO2 emissions, for example, from OPG to predict the 5 peak hours that where the global adjustment is calculated?
Sorry, can you repeat that?
It's interesting to me because you've pointed out that there's a very weak correlation between demand and price.
Mm-hmm.
So there are going to be weak correlations between other binary criteria here. And the question is, could there be a correlation between OPG's estimated emissions, carbon dioxide or greenhouse gas emissions, and when the peak 5 hours would be occurring for the calculation of global adjustment?
I don't think so. So I mean, the emissions are going to depend on what plants are out or online at that time, and and usually that's most of them if you're reaching the peak hours. So I can't see there being it's certainly no useful correlation because essentially we don't know what the emissions are until we work them out much later on. We don't have a sort of an hourly emissions data stream anywhere that I've heard of. So I can't see that being of any benefit there. Some of the things that I brought up, obviously weather is one of the biggest factors for a summer peaking load, right? So what you often notice is if the temperatures are very high and they're sort of up in the, to maybe up to 35, you would see demand go up the first day in the afternoon, go up a little more the next day in the afternoon. And by the third day, people are starting to lose temper, they're getting hot, and then the load tends to go up quite a bit. And so, and it's usually then the afternoon hours, the sort of 1500, 1600 hour marks where you see the peaks occurring, and it tails off a little bit after that. But I've never seen anything that I could correlate, I think, with emissions themselves.
Okay, a different question, excuse me, different couple of questions pertaining to the subsidies between the two classes. So because there's appears to be subsidization of one class of customer to another, it isn't just power at cost. So who is deciding what is the degree of subsidization from one class of consumer to the other?
Well, essentially that was done, it was industry that was pushing for that change to take place. There was some study at the time as to what the real costs are for that, for meeting, the peak capacity. And that I don't think that information, the calculation was ever published, but it was known to have taken place in the negotiation. So, and it was really, I think, a combination of things between the government, the IESO, and industry that arrived at that point at the time. And of course, every dollar that industry doesn't pay, the rest of us do get to pay. So okay. It's something that you're dropping Peter to pay Paul, literally, in this.
Very good, and I'm glad your name is Peter and not mine. So
yeah,
very good. If we step away from the industrial side and look at the consumer side, there's a question pertaining to the time of use charges for individual consumers.
Mhm.
If the cost is relatively independent of demand, then why is demand being shifted and changed by applying a time of use application
Yeah,
for consumers?
yeah, that's a very good point. And I mean, what they're aiming to do by using price there, and it's something that we do all the time. Well, you want to encourage something, you make it cheap. You want to discourage something, you make it expensive. And I think with the three options that we've now got, you've got the one which is just play a flat rate whenever you use it. You've got the middle one, which is the sort of the old off-peak one, and now you've got a super off-peak one where you get it really cheaply overnight. What they would like to do is to take take generation from those peak hours and those daytime hours and move them into the night. So if you like sort of energy movement from the daytime into the nighttime, that would overall reduce the cost to everybody, right? So if you do that, then you don't need to put in the next generation that's going to be used just to cover off peaks. So it's trying to move people, to change people, rather than perhaps trying to charge them fairly. If you were to try to do something like that, it would be a lot more complex than what we're doing here.
Okay. We do
But
have
that's
an
a good point.
answer.
I like that.
Okay, and we do have an answer here from Alex Palamaca, who is with Blue Water Power, local distribution company in the Sarnia, Lambton County area. Further responding to the prior question, he can confirm that customers who are connected through a local distribution company are allowed to participate in Class A pricing if they qualify. So it gets back to that point that you were making about the Class A pricing. What is the total, pardon me, what is the capacity that they are able to take, or the amount of electricity that they consume through the year? So that's just an additional point added by Alex.
Yeah.
There's strategies, as you said, third-party companies that are trying to predict what are the 5 global adjustment peak hours. There's a question looking for an opinion, and I know you can answer this one quite handily as well, Peter. What do you think about having an electrolyzer and a generator towards the grid or the industrial plant using peak hours for avoiding high global adjustment costs? So that this would be somebody who is able to basically exercise some arbitrage and generate their own electricity, pull electricity from the grid for a period of time. This is suggesting an electrolyzer, and which would be producing hydrogen, of course, and then generating the electricity back into the grid or into their own plant so they can avoid those peak hours.
Yeah. Well, yes, as you know, we did run do a study with Queen's University on that very issue, and what we were looking at was a 500 megawatt unit that would take electricity during off-peak hours, produce hydrogen, put that hydrogen into a storage cavern underground, and then take that hydrogen back out of there and run it through produce electricity as it was needed during the following day or some other time. It gives you a lot of opportunities. It's superior to using a battery in many ways, in that you can increase the capacity much larger. Typically backup batteries that are installed are only for 1 hour or maybe 2 hours. But if your cabin is sufficiently large, you can put all sorts of volumes of hydrogen into it. The disadvantage is, particularly with hydrogen, is just the efficiency of conversion. And there are high losses in going from electricity to hydrogen, hydrogen back to electricity. The project that we looked at specifically had an extra element to it, in that we could sell that hydrogen, that clean hydrogen, renewable green hydrogen, We could sell that to the refineries in Sarnia, which would replace some of their hydrogen that they're producing from methane. So it would reduce their emissions as well.
And we have a detailed explanation of that on our bowmancenter.com website. There's a technical question here that I'll just read it as it has been presented, and it gets back to the point about some of the calculations for the global adjustment. You mentioned that there is a heat rate that is calculated for the different providers. How
Yep.
is the heat rate determined?
So basically, if you're building a plant and you're going to go to the ISO to get a contract, they will want to know what equipment are you using. Part of the proposal that you're going to put together will define what equipment you are going to use in there and what the heat rate of that will be, because that's going to be one of the factors that they select the winners on, if you like, is going to be what is the heat rate that you're going to use. So that's really a factor of the equipment that is built. If you're looking at a combined cycle gas-fired plant, you're going to get a heat rate of perhaps 7, say, as an example. That type of facility then comes along with some warts in that it takes time to start it up. Right, you've got to heat up all of the metal in the boiler over a period of time. So it's probably got a 10-hour or so startup time, during which time it burns gas, which is detracting from the efficiency. But that might suit in some things that you want to do. If you're looking for a plant that you can run up very quickly, then you're going to go for a simple cycle gas turbine setup, which is going to have a heat rate of probably 11 or 12. Right, so it's got a much worse heat rate, but it's got the factors in that you can run it up quickly, and within 5 minutes you've got generation coming out of it, and you can run it up and down and shut it down, again quickly. So the ISO is then, when they get these offers in, they're looking at comparing the two. How much do we need the quick startup time, and how much do we need the lower heat rate? But it's not a question of sort of an agreement. It's going to be based on calculations that you do, that the ISO is going to see what equipment you've got and what overall efficiency it's going to bring.
Okay, there's one other question pertaining to the global adjustment contracts, and is it possible to find out who are the major global adjustment contract holders?
I'm not certain what they mean by that. You're looking for
the expansion of this is that BNPD, which is about 60% of total global adjustment charges. The wind and solar percentage is a small part of global adjustment because power contribution is low.
Okay.
Yeah, so
some of that information, the ISO publishes an awful lot of information. Some of it is very difficult to find, though, and I do suspect sometimes that they don't want it to be found, not easily anyway. I don't know if I've seen a breakdown of where those costs go.
Okay.
Yeah, I couldn't say for sure whether that is easily available. It's probably in their data somewhere. And I'm sure there are consultants that have been able to extract it, but it's probably not in the public domain.
Okay. There's 3 questions that start to look at some of the longer term trends and even forecasting. So this is potentially wishful thinking, but we'll ask the questions anyway. So can you explain why the HOEP has remained so low or even declined, and do you expect it to be this low in the near future?
Yeah, so If you look at the difference between the market in Ontario and say the market in Alberta, they look very similar in a number of cases, except in Alberta, what you tend to see is that there are some times when the price just shoots up and stays up for a longer period of time. And those are the times when generators this for a very short period of time, because that's what they need to do in order to finance their generation throughout the rest of the year. So, most of the time they can be making a very small amount of profit on there, but they get those occasional bursts. In Ontario, we don't see that. We don't get those very high prices or very few of them. The government, I mean, there's nothing more the government would like more than to completely erase global adjustment and have the HOEP run at some much higher level. The problem is that having moved into this complex market arrangement we've got here, there's no easy way to back out of this into what you think of as the sort of the typical market where just the prices vary and demand is driven by them. So honestly, I don't see a whole lot of change happening there. There are some things going on that are moving low-priced hours to higher priced hours. So there are not as many negative hours now. At one point in time, when it was quite common overnight to see prices go negative, which literally meant that surrounding areas would take our power if we paid them to take it away. That doesn't happen so much. It does still happen. And again, it's one of those things that when the public hear about this, how do you explain that's the way it's got to be? It doesn't. Politically, it's sort of dynamite for anybody. The politicians want to stay well away from this. They would love to say they'd love to see global adjustment go down and everything go onto HOEP, but there's no easy way of doing that. But what we might see is that more and more of these intercompany agreements take place. They're going to take place without any of the global adjustment connections. They're going to take place, and there'll be some network charges and those kind of things, but they won't be subject to any of the pricing. So that may reduce this. We may see over a period of time that as more of the load becomes sort of company to company, that the area where we've got the global adjustment charges is going to shrink, and you'll see an improvement in that.
Okay, there's another question trying to look forward as well, and I think you're getting close to with your explanation. You're getting close to this. Can you speak to the IESO market renewal program, and in particular, how do you think it's going to affect supply contracts?
It's kind of difficult to say. What's happening at the moment is a number of existing plants are getting recontracted to run for longer periods. The government's plan to meet 2050 demand is somewhat vague and wishful thinking at the moment in terms of where all of this energy is going to come from. So, I mean, they're looking for, I think it was about 15,000 megawatts of nuclear capacity to be built between now and 2050. That is an awful lot of generation. They were looking for, I think it was 24,000 megawatts of what they're looking at as being natural gas, but natural gas without any environmental damage to it. So it would have to be somehow offset. They really didn't explain how this would occur. I think somebody had been smoking something, to be honest, but to expect to be able to get this much gas from Alberta without any suggestion that there were emissions attached to it. I don't know how we could achieve that. So there's an awful long way to go between where we are now and where we want to be in 2050. And much will depend on how the government reacts and whether they do accelerate these things as quickly as they hope to.
Okay. The last question I'll ask, because we're running out of time here, and I want everybody to I want to have a few final comments here as well, is regarding forecast accuracy. In Ontario in particular, as you said, the IESO is responsible for producing a short-term forecast as well as a long-term 10-year forecast, and those get issued fairly frequently. Can you comment about the forecasting of electricity supply and forecasting of electricity demand in Ontario?
So, I mean, they've been doing this for a long time. The one thing I would say is that if you think about, what you're doing in the forecast, if you over forecast and overbuild, you've got spare capacity there, which costs you some money. If you under forecast and underbuild, you have got a political bomb going off here because industry is going to be shut down. There'll be lack of investments. There'll be all kinds of problems with it. If you were the person doing the forecast, what would you do? Would you go a little high or a little low? And I think, if you look back at all their past forecasts, they've always been a little high, which is exactly what you would expect them to do, to play safe on this. There's no prize for there's a big penalty if you under forecast. So I think that's kind of human nature. That's something that is going to continue. But if you look at what the power requirements will be for us, if we were to convert everything to electricity, all of our energy consumption to electricity, so no more natural gas, diesel, gasoline, anything like that, you'd need to pretty much double our present capacity and our present total generation. In fact, I think it's even a little above that, depending upon all the sort of efficiency improvements you want to make. That's an awful lot of generation to put in place between now and then. We've got 26 years left to do that, right? That is a huge increase, and it's probably sort of what 3 or 4% a year increase that you'd need to do in order to double that capacity in that kind of period of time. So yeah, it's a big challenge, but there's going to be a lot, and there's going to be a lot changing in this industry over that period of time. Unfortunately, it's been, I often say to people, 40 years in this industry, it's been quite boring a lot of the time because progress takes place so slowly. Well, now all of a sudden it's very exciting, and I'd love to be a young engineer coming out now with the opportunities to do things that they've got.
Okay.
Another life.
Indeed, and one which I hope the Bowman Center for Sustainable Energy is able to offer some influence. We do have a number of reports on our website. This presentation has been recorded and will be on our website as well. Peter Smith, thank you very, very much for sharing your expertise and your understanding of the electricity system in Ontario.